My name is Dave Powell from Climate Outreach. I lead the Climate Engagement Lab. And we're having a chat today to a couple of organisations, related organisations, that we worked with in the Climate Engagement Lab in early 2021, I think it was, looking at the issue of how to engage parents with climate change. And we're going to talk to Rowan and Maya from Parents for Future and Mothers Rise Up. We're going to talk about the work that we did and the things that they've learned, and hopefully capture some lessons that will be useful for other organisations. Also on the call is Nuri Sidecourse, also from Climate Outreach. Hello, Nuri.
Hello, Dave.
And Nuri's in charge. So Nuri, over to you.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I wasn't involved with the project until this stage, so I'm really excited to be learning for the first time about what you've all been doing. Can we just start by giving you a chance to introduce yourself quickly? Can I give the floor to you, Rowan?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Rowan, I'm based in Oxford, and I'm an organiser with Parents for Future UK. I also work with Parents for Future Global as a kind of global network. By background, I'm a lawyer, so I've worked in human rights and environmental law for about 10 years. And in 2019, I got involved in helping to set up Parents for Future, which was when the youth strike movement really became very significant as a climate movement. The Fridays for Future movement, and in the UK, it was called UK Student Climate Network. And when those strikes started in the UK, me and a bunch of other parents got together and started working out how to try to engage parents alongside the youth activists to try to make that movement more intergenerational, recognizing that we as adults can't stand by and wait for the kids to take action on climate. And particularly from my perspective, I've got two very young children. They're now 7 and 3, but at that stage they were a lot smaller. And I felt like I couldn't wait until they were old enough to be able to speak out on climate for themselves, and that it felt very important for me as a parent, recognizing the enormity of climate change and the impact it will have on their future, that I need to start speaking up on their behalf and use my voice in any way that I can to push for climate action as quickly as possible. So I connected with other parents around the UK and also in Oxford, and helped set up a local group here and to connect with parents elsewhere. And we've been working to build more local parents groups across the UK, and also to work on some more significant, more strategic campaigns around some of the bigger systemic issues. So this is making sure that we're looking at the systems as well as the actions that we can take as individuals. And we work very closely with Mothers Rise Up. We're very happy to have lots of other organisations working in the parent climate space, but PFF in the UK and Mothers Rise Up are kind of two of the main ones that are doing some of the exciting work here.
Fantastic. That's really interesting and really helpful as a context. Maya, can you tell us a bit about Mothers Rise Up and about how you got involved?
And thanks, Rowan. So I'm Maya with Mothers Rise Up. I'm based in London, and my background is as a campaigner and as an aid worker, mainly with Oxfam for many years. Of course, I was aware of the climate crisis, but I have to be honest, it always seemed like a distant concern compared with some of the human rights issues that I saw day to day in my work. And then I think similarly to Rowan, I had a wake up moment when the youth strikes were taking, when the youth were taking to the streets, and when my own children started coming back from school asking me questions that I just couldn't answer about the world heating up and animals becoming extinct. And by chance, I got together with some mums in my local area who were themselves connected with other mothers. And we thought, you know what, we are going to organise a march for International Mother's Day. This was back in 2019. We thought it would just be quite a small affair, but we put our all into organising it. And it was a bit like when you're a teenager and you throw a party and you think, how many people are going to turn up? And then in the end, there were about 3,000 people that came to Parliament. And it was this really beautiful moment. Most of them were first-time protesters with their babies on their backs. They hadn't been out on the streets before. And it was really trying to create a space, like Rowan mentioned, for parents with younger children who couldn't go on strike, but who wanted to kind of express their solidarity with the youth strikers, but also demonstrate that parents, and in our case, particularly mothers, had to step up, and we had power and we had a voice. And that was really the birth of Mothers Rise Up. And since then, we've done all kinds of direct action and campaigning and storytelling in the UK. And similarly, we connect up with global networks and fellow parent organisers and mother organisers in many, many countries around the world.
That's fantastic and massively inspiring as well. You've sort of both touched on this a little bit, but could you tell us a bit more about why parents specifically as a group to engage, and what kind of the main challenges that you faced in trying to engage them were?
Yeah, shall I jump in? Why parents specifically? I mean, parents are everywhere. I think this was, so firstly, it was a very personal thing. What do I identify as? You know, who am I and what do I bring to the climate movement? And it was my engagement as a parent and the fact that this felt personal for me. I recognized that my children were going to be impacted by climate, and that was a very personal driver. And then recognizing that I didn't want to take that as my children are going to be impacted, therefore how high a wall can I build around them, but actually how much can I change for all of the children of their generation, and how can I best use the skills I've got. So it's a very personal motivation, and that's very powerful. And I think if people start to recognize that climate change is a personal issue and start to respond to it emotionally, then that does have a real power, rather than responding to it in a kind of purely intellectual sense. So I think there's a power in that form of communication and bringing emotion into it. But also parents really are everywhere. Parents are in every school, in every community, in every government, in every business, you know, in every sphere of life. And if you can start to get people to make that connection between the climate crisis and themselves as a parent, and then apply that into me as a business leader, actually, this is how I can make some change on climate, because my specific role enables me to make decisions that affect this, this, and this, or me as a decision maker in, you know, maybe I'm a government leader, maybe whatever it might be, maybe I'm a farmer and I can choose different things. There's lots of ways that parents can engage that aren't protest. So for some people, protest is going to be the thing that really speaks to them, and absolutely there is a role for protest. Very much. I think there is a role for protest, and right now in the UK it feels like that's a role that needs to be protected, as it does in many countries around the world. But for many parents, protest isn't the thing that speaks to them as a way to take action. And so we were trying to get at this fact that parents really are in all spheres of life, and there are lots of ways that parents can engage around the climate crisis.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think we're also really honing in on this concept of fierce love, and that's what imbues a lot of our work. So I think there's a lot of climate organizing that's kind of rooted, and I think rightly, in outrage and in anger and in calling out the injustice, and that is really important and that needs to happen. But I think our approach is starting with this idea of love for our kids, love for all kids, and also appealing to decision makers as parents, as fathers, as mothers. And we know from some of the research that we did through the lab that this concept of intergenerational duty, this concept of care for the next generation, does cut across ideological and political boundaries. So at the intellectual level, the parent voice can be really unifying, and you know, we think that's important. And then also at practical level, parents, as Rowan said, parents are everywhere, and we have these incredible networks. So we can have those conversations about climate at the school gates. We can normalize the conversation. You know, I take my kids to football and I'm there in a muddy football pitch, but I'm also talking to the fellow mums and dads about some of the climate work. So I think it's the power is also in being unifying and in normalizing. But one thing I think we have learned, and again, this was something that was really helpful in the conversations we've had with climate outreach, that being a parent is an identity, right? But it's not a value, and there's no kind of a uniform way of parenting. And actually the way you parent is often a signifier of your underlying values. So we've learned a lot that it's not enough to just speak to people as parents. You know, we also have to understand their other values and their other identities and how they intersect. And that's been kind of a really important learning point for us, and something that I think we gained a lot of from when talking to climate outreach.
Great. I mean, that is a very nice segue to move on to what did you actually do with climate outreach, and what did climate outreach do with you? I'll pass it back to you, Rowan.
So yeah, we really enjoyed the work with climate outreach. It really helped, as Maya said, for us to kind of refine down, I think, some of the ideas that we had about these very broad concepts of, but we're all parents and therefore surely we should all care about the climate, and actually dig into that a little bit and say, but actually that looks different for different people, and the language you need to use to reach different people around climate issues looks different, even as parents. And so the work that we did with the lab in kind of concrete terms, we went through looking at some of what Parents for Future and Mothers Rise Up are doing at the moment, and some of the kind of messages. We developed a series of message frames and then put those out to testing. So we looked at kind of some messages that really distilled down, these are some of the key things that we're trying to do with the parent climate movement, and came up with 5 core messages. I think it was 5 messages that we tested in the end. And then we put those out for testing through YouGov to a sample of people that climate outreach had previously worked with. So they had some sort of underlying information about how those people could, how they've responded to climate questions in the past, how that related to the Britain Talks climate analysis that climate outreach has worked on. And that really helped us to understand, if we put these sorts of parental messages out to people, this is how that aligns with some of their other kind of value sets. This is how they respond to different messaging, and this is how we might more effectively communicate with them around some of the types of work that we're trying to do. That helped us to think about how we reach different audiences. And it really helped us to think a bit more strategically about, if we're trying to reach different groups of parents, then this is how we might want to do that. And it helped us also to think about who we're already reaching, which is something that we'd thought about a bit, because we have knowledge of who's really actively involved in the parents' work at the moment. But it helped us to really kind of step back and have that more analytical perspective on, actually, this is what that looks like right now, and this is kind of how that translates into mobilizing work, and this is how those people might respond, and this is where they get their news from, and this is how you reach that group of people, because they read this news, they spend this time on social media and this platform. If you use this word, they're more likely to be interested, whereas not if you're using a different word, etc. It was a way of working that we hadn't had the time to really step back and have somebody guide us through that kind of perspective on what we're doing previously, because we're a voluntary organisation. We're not people that have lots of expertise around strategic communications, and so having that input was really invaluable in helping us to think through how to be a bit more effective in what we're doing.
Maya or Dave, would either of you like to add anything?
Something I'd like to say, I think, is that the reason that climate outreach in the lab has innovation partners at all is precisely for working with organisations like Parents for Future, where there's an idea that if there's anything remotely in it at all, the idea being that you could mobilise parents, in this case, on a much bigger scale by appealing to parent identity. If there's anything remotely in that at all, it could be really significant, both for the climate movement, but for other organisations in the space. And we want to partner with and find organisations who have similar ideas, similar innovative proposals. And the work that we did, I think, helped Parents for Future and Mothers Rise Up really drill into, understand the extent to which that hypothesis might be true. And I'd be really interested to hear, you might come to this, Nuri, about what you do now differently, maybe as a result of the support that we gave you. The good or bad, it'd be good to know about it, because that would be the real benefit for us of getting involved at what was quite an early stage in your thinking. Would be knowing that we helped you to do something that maybe you wouldn't have done before.
Do you want to jump in, or I can?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure if it's so much a case of what we did differently, but I think it's what we've done better. So the message testing process was very, very helpful. And so that was done with climate outreach, and also, am I allowed to mention them, with Glimpse, the PR agency, who were also fantastic. And also, I should just say as an aside, we had a really very good and very challenging session with George Marshall, where he put, as you said, Dave, a lot of these ideas to the test. And I think it was challenging some of our more perhaps wishful hypotheses about how we could just mobilize parents and get this revolution happening. So all of that, I think, has been really, really helpful in injecting kind of realism and also thought into the way we work across the board. And that's quite difficult to quantify, but that will stay with us, I think, for a very long time. It was really super helpful. I think what I took from it, I think what Mothers Rise Up took for it, and to a certain extent Parents for Future, is that we can be challenging, we can run campaigns, we can call out decision makers, but we can do it in a way that still maintains a unifying voice. And I think we're much more mindful of how the language we use will resonate with different audiences. It was really interesting that a lot of the parent messaging resonated, especially with loyal nationalists, which isn't a segment that I think we were actively kind of trying to reach or even necessarily have the networks to do so. So I think for us, the first step was making sure that the language we did use at the very least didn't alienate one segment and was unifying across all 7. And that's actually, you have to be intentional to do that. Otherwise, you kind of fall back into the progressive activist language that we tend to rely on. And maybe later we can get to it. But then I think we've actually run some campaigns which have relied heavily on that framing and on that language and on those appeals, and they've had success. When they've been tested out in the real world. So yeah, it was brilliant. It was really, really useful, and it's had ripple effects for both of our groups.
I think in terms of how it's been applied by Parents for Future, I think part of it was just building our confidence, because as a grassroots group and as a group that doesn't have this kind of strategic communications experience within the team, it helped us to have a bit more confidence that what we thought we were doing right, some of it we are doing right, and some of it is effective, and we are able to reach people, and we are able to use that kind of emotive language. Felt that some of the work was challenged, certainly, but some of it was validated as well. It's given us a bit more focus. So I think working out actually, if we're trying to reach that group, or if we're trying to have this impact with that campaign, this is the kind of language. We have done a little bit more work around kind of imagery, and I'd love to think more about images and more of the kind of design aspects of it as well. But also thinking about, are we the right messenger to do some of this work, and that framing around who's the messenger, how's that going to be received by some of the audiences you're working with? That's been really helpful for us to think about. And I think it's helped us to think about being a bit more intentional, recognizing that there is real potential in this work. And as Maya said, the response rate from the Loyal Nationals isn't something that we'd anticipated. But it's shown that there is real potential across the political spectrum with some of this parent perspective work. And if we want to really use that, then we do need to be quite intentional. And, for us as a volunteer group, some of that's not going to happen with the kind of structure and the volunteer status that we've got at the moment. So if we want to use that, then we need to think about how we do that, how we resource it, who's going to be doing that in different spaces, and whether you're kind of using some very targeted work in different parts of the country, etc. I think some of our local groups have definitely applied it quite specifically. So where we've got local Parents for Future groups in conservative leaning council districts, etc., then they've been able to take that quite quickly and use some of that language and say, actually, on the posters that we're putting up and on the thing, the leaflets that we're handing out, we're using that language. We're working on the kind of message testing that's going to resonate much more with that type of political audience that they've got locally. And that's been brilliant, seeing people really recognizing the kind of direct applicability of some of the work.
That's really interesting to hear. And in terms of are you picking up any difference in the responses that you're getting from those audiences following the communications input that you've had from the lab?
I mean, we haven't been able to measure it. So I'd love to be able to put some resourcing into kind of measuring what the different response rates are. And I think that's something that we could do a bit through social media, but we haven't really had the resources to do that. And we'd need to know exactly, how do we set that up properly so that we're doing that with, Facebook testing or with Instagram response rates. We haven't really had the knowledge and the resources to really be able to get that data on the response rates. I think anecdotally, yes, We've been able to see that people are responding differently to some of the messaging that we're putting out. But I don't feel like I can kind of point to really concrete examples of if we'd not used the data and if we'd kind of done it differently, then we would have not had the response we have. I think one piece though where we can probably show that some of the impact of the work is in some of the work that we did around COP, where we had a big focus in the COP work, which was led by the UK group, but was also bringing in kind of the wider global network, which was around air pollution, children's health, and then making the link to fossil fuels as a kind of significant causal factor. And we had a letter that we drafted jointly with other organisations. So Campaign Collective was another organisation that were really important in helping to pull that together. And we drafted a letter and then sent that out for sign-on by as many parent groups as possible. So not parent climate groups, but parent groups of any form. Any group that identified as being a parent-led group could sign on to this letter from anywhere in the world. And we had just under 500 groups sign on to that letter. And a lot of those were PTA groups and NCT groups. So they were the parent-teacher associations, and they were the National Childbirth Trust group. Not just in the UK, but lots of countries have that similar structure where there's a group of parents that are working as part of a school community. They're not climate groups. So these are not groups that would typically sign on to a letter which was calling very explicitly for no new fossil fuels. That was what the letter said. It was a letter that was addressed to Alok Sharma and the heads of state at COP26, calling for no new fossil fuels. And that felt like a really clear demonstration of the fact that if we use the language well, then we can reach outside the climate bubble. We can reach parent audiences that's way beyond what you reach with most climate engagement work. And you can start to engage parent audiences around something that's as targeted as a kind of very specific fossil fuel focused piece of work. So I guess that would be one example of kind of starting to reach that really broad audience and by applying some of this work.
And Maya, is your experience with Mothers Rise Up similar in terms of getting a different response to your communications after you worked with the lab?
Yeah, so I think the COP example is a really good one. And then we've also been running a campaign targeting Bruce Carnegie Brown, the chair of Lloyd's of London, to stop insuring fossil fuels. So he runs a company that is one of the biggest insurers of fossil fuels. And we've been trying to persuade him to change tack. And the approach that we've taken is to appeal to him as a father and appeal to him as a loving parent. And there have been many different elements to it, but we did very explicitly draw on some of the language and the framing from climate outreach. And whereas most of the approaches towards Lloyd's of London have been quite, they've been quite hard, we took this different approach of appealing to his better instincts. And the result is that we are the first, I think, or one of the first campaign groups that got a meeting with Lloyd's of London, and also have had this kind of unprecedented interaction with Bruce Carnegie Brown on Twitter. And I think that's because we were seeking to humanize him and humanize the employees. And although that's not directly related to the segmentation, I think it comes from the idea that I think run through a lot of climate outreach's work and the lab's work about, looking for that unifying angle. And that doesn't mean you hold back in terms of the ask. It doesn't mean you don't hold some of these corporate leaders to account, but it's done in a different way that can actually create room for dialogue. And that's what we've sought to do and are continuing to do. So trying to forge a new way of, I think, campaigning that allows for dialogue while also holding the powers that be to account. And that was influenced for sure by the work we did through climate outreach.
That's really interesting to hear, and especially that it has that you found it's maybe been quite useful almost in terms of your advocacy language in that context. I was wondering a little bit if you could tell us, so as a volunteer-led organisation, what do you think that sort of the challenges or the opportunities to kind of receiving the kind of support that you got from the lab?
I think that the biggest challenge was with the implementation. So we had all of this rich information through the message testing, and we didn't necessarily have the resources all the time. I mean, it's partly, I think this is an issue with volunteer-led organizations, but perhaps with all organizations, that we know we've got all this information, but how do you then operationalize it? And that is really difficult to do. And I think then there's that mismatch between where your messages and your framing resonates, but where you've actually got networks and volunteers on the ground to then take that message. And it kind of speaks to what Rowan was saying about who is the messenger. So I think that felt like a limitation, that we had the analysis, but we then didn't kind of figure out what's the battle plan. How do we take this information out into the world? And if we were better resourced, if we had teams, then that's something we could have started to do. But instead, it was done, in a fairly ad hoc way, still in a really helpful way, as we've described, but not in kind of a systematic way that it might have been done, if we had paid teams that could do it all.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think we found it was a big time commitment actually doing the work with the lab, and we were very happy to put that time in. But for kind of a volunteer group, it was quite intensive at times, kind of trying to keep up with the pace of the work. But we were really grateful to have Beth as the consultant that we worked with through Climate Outreach. She was absolutely brilliant at kind of holding our hands and meeting us where we were as a group. She was brilliant to work with, which was fantastic. I'd agree with Maya that I would love to have felt able to spend more time personally or as a group on communicating the outcomes of the work internally and externally, because our intention was never that we are the only organization that learns from this. The intention was we want to grow the whole of the parent climate movement. We're not about trying to just grow a single brand. It's like this is a whole concept and a whole way of engaging people around climate, but we kind of need to have more people that have got time dedicated to be able to do that internal and external communication piece, and share new local group that's setting up in this region. Actually, let's spend a few hours digging into all of this research that we've just done and saying, well, actually this might apply, and maybe if you use this language locally, then that might really work with your particular audience. And it would be lovely to have the resources to be able to do that kind of applied capacity building training with the groups that we've got, and then share some of this. And we've done a bit of that because Maya and I particularly, we have got wide networks within the parent climate space. So we have been able to share some of this in a very ad hoc, very kind of natural way with the wider groups that we work with in the UK and internationally. But it would be great to have more resource to be able to do that more intentionally.
Can I ask you a little bit about sort of what has permanently changed within your respective organizations about how you think about engagement internally, if anything?
I think just being a bit more thoughtful and a bit more intentional, and kind of not expecting this message that we're putting out that deeply resonates with me personally or with kind of the small group that I'm working with is going to resonate with everybody. And being very mindful of the fact that there's lots of reasons why that specific message is going to resonate with some people and is not going to resonate with others. And so I think it's been a kind of a learning curve for those of us that are leading a lot of the kind of strategic messaging work to think more carefully about who is it we're trying to reach, what's the intended outcome of this piece of work, and then actually, what sort of language do we need to use to be able to do that? But also, I think the point that Maya made earlier about making sure that we're not alienating people with some of the language, that's been really important too. And that's something that we've slightly struggled with some of the parent workers. We don't want it to be bland. You don't want it to be kind of work that doesn't really resonate with anybody. It does need to really resonate effectively with some people. And to be able to do that, you do need to think about who's the audience you're trying to reach with this. And then do that well, rather than something that doesn't really resonate with any of the audience groups that you're working with, because that's not going to be very effective. And the other thing I think has been thinking about the messenger. I think that's been something that's been really important for us to think about. And kind of recognizing that we are growing this whole parent climate space. And that means that you need to have multiple messengers. You need to have different people that are going to work that are going to kind of engage different audiences of parents. So actually a strategy that is just about building up a single organisation is fundamentally flawed, because that single messenger isn't going to resonate with everybody. You do need to have the different versions of the parent climate kind of movement as a whole that can speak to different parts of that messenger segment. And so that encourages much more collaborative working and experience sharing, and kind of, you know, saying, actually, you're doing a great job of engaging that segment, so we're going to focus on some other pieces or use a different approach. And that sort of collaborative way of working is definitely a feature of the parent climate space, and possibly a feature of female-led organisations in part, which the parent climate work generally is. So that's been important to that messenger angle.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think this research came at a moment, and so not just the work we did through the engagement lab, but the broader More in Common, and then Britain Talks climate research came at a time of a lot of soul searching, didn't it, within the climate movement, where people wanted answers for why it wasn't just enough to hammer home the message again and again and again. And I think that led to some disillusionment and some falling away of like, well, why aren't people waking up? You know, and I think this research has been really important in explaining that in a way that's empathetic, and, you know, I think that it isn't judgmental. So I think it's really helped kind of at a much deeper level. It's, I think, helped organisers reconcile a lot of the conflicting emotions you have around climate organising, and how to reach people, and how to, you know, adjust your messaging while staying true to your core principles and core motivation. So I think that is certainly like a long-term effect of the lab, but also of the wider research, I think.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing all of those answers with us. That's massively helpful. Before I pass over to Dave very quickly, just to wrap up, is there anything else that you want to add or to say?
I think just on the record to say how grateful we are to have the support that we had from the lab, and to be selected as an innovation partner, which really did help. And it felt like, even though we as an organisation were at a very early stage of growth and as a kind of grassroots group, that felt like a vote of confidence in the potential of the work, which I guess is what Dave's saying. You know, if this does have potential, then it is worth investing in and understanding. And that for us really helped us to, I think, almost take slightly more seriously the kind of the potential of the work that we're doing, and to give us a slightly different perspective on it, and kind of invest in the time and thinking through what we're doing, as well as just cracking on with doing the work. So we're really grateful to have had the opportunity to do that. And I think it has genuinely been really important in the growth of the work for Parents for Future UK and Mothers Rise Up, and kind of by extension, because of the relationships we hold with the wider parent climate movement, and helping us to kind of expand and think through that work globally. So grateful to Climate Outreach for taking that on, and for working with us.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that. Thank you. It was a really fascinating and formative experience that's had these long-term implications, but also real time. Like, as we were doing the work with the Climate Engagement Lab, we launched a new collaboration with children's illustrators, and we kind of landed on the name through this iterative process with Glimpse and Beth and Climate Outreach, which has been brilliant and has like continued to make waves. So it had a huge influence at different levels. So thank you, and we hope that it can continue in other forms.
I mean, thank you as well, because it wasn't entirely selfless, in that we really wanted to know the answer to the questions we were working with you with. Right? Like, can we apply what Climate Outreach knows to help an exciting young organisation, but also to answer some of these questions? You know, applying it specifically to parents, because we were as interested in the answers to that as you guys. Thank you for being such wonderful partners to work with, and for the work that you're doing, and for your time today. It's really appreciated.